Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. Welcome to One to One. A recent headline in the New York Times declared that the civil rights era is collapsing before our eyes. The article cited the recent decision by the Tennessee legislature to eliminate the state's only majority Black and Democratic House voting district. Louisiana and Alabama have also recently redrawn their congressional maps to reduce the number of Black minority districts. Is the civil rights era that began in the 1960s collapsing? And what, if anything, can be done to shore it up? Here to answer these questions are Gloria Browne-Marshall, professor of constitutional law at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and author of The Voting Rights War, and Joseph Lowndes, professor of political science at Hunter College and director of the public policy program at Hunter's Roosevelt House. Welcome. So, is the United States experiencing the collapse of the gains of the civil rights era?
I believe so. I think it's not only the collapse of the gains of the civil rights era, but there's also an erosion of our democracy itself. At the core of what we think of ourselves as citizens is our ability to vote. And when we see the U.S. Supreme Court and we see our states undermining the basic right to vote, then we know that it wasn't just for people of African descent that we had these civil rights protections. These protections were symbolic for many people and necessary for people of color in order to be a part of our democracy. That core has been taken away, and with it, a beating against our wall of democracy, and I don't think the firewall is strong enough to withstand too many more of these types of decisions that have taken place recently.
Now, as a civil rights attorney, you were very much involved in the struggle, for voting rights and, other rights of Black people. And the author of the Times article compares this particular period to the collapse of Reconstruction. Do you think her analogy is correct?
Yes, and I don't think it's the only time this has happened, but I think it's quite common to see in 1890 when Senator Vardaman actually said that they were putting in poll taxes, enacting literacy tests and grandfather clause laws in order to undermine the rights of Black people, because the power of the Black vote since 1870 with the passage of the 15th Amendment changes the outcome of elections. And that power was something that many people in the Black community didn't understand, and many within the white communities or non-Black communities didn't embrace. But these conservative groups know that power, and that's what we're seeing right now is the undermining of it, as they did in the 1890s, leading to Plessy versus Ferguson. And I'll give you this one example with the Louisiana case. In Louisiana, before Plessy versus Ferguson, the 1896 case, there were 130,000 Black men registered to vote in Louisiana. By 1900, after Plessy versus Ferguson, the 1896 case, there were 5,300. And so you see what happened then, and you're going to see what happens now when the Supreme Court and states and conservative groups work against the democracy and the rights of Black people to vote.
Joe, was the Voting Rights Act do you think it was the single most important accomplishment of the civil rights era of the 60s?
I would say it was one of them. It was kind of the capstone to what the federal government is going to do to protect Black voters and Black people more generally, insofar as it finally made good on the promise of the 15th Amendment, that each vote would count and that each voter would have a voice. And it eliminated, poll taxes and every other nefarious way that Southern states had put in place in the 1890s and afterwards to get rid of the Black vote. And put in place also strict scrutiny for any changes that state election boards would want to pass. And so in those ways, it was certainly a pinnacle. I mean, there was also the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which kind of broke the social back of Jim Crow.
Right.
But this was in terms of politics, I would say it was. The only thing I would say is it was also, I think we're tracking two things at once here. One, what happens in institutions, and another thing that happens in culture. And the civil rights era, or the long black freedom struggle, which long precedes 1964, 1965,
Right.
changed attitudes and changed beliefs about black citizenship. And this goes back to struggles that happened with veterans coming back from World War II. It goes back to early in the 20th century with fights that the NAACP was involved in. And by the 1960s, there was a cultural shift, and the civil rights movement led the way and opened up possibilities for other movements as well. And so in those ways, the Voting Rights Act was an important piece, but we should think about it now as they're dismantling it, what other resources we have and what other fronts we have to fight on, I think.
Sort of in what ways has it been dismantled, the Voting Rights Act, and what remains? Either of you.
Well, first there was the attack in 2013 with the case of Shelby County versus Holder, in which the pre-clearance clause of the Voting Rights Act, something that President Lyndon Johnson understood. He was someone who grew up in racist Texas. He understood racism. He understood the power that it had, and he wanted this jewel in the crown, the Voting Rights Act. The three-judge court was required to look at any proposed voting legislation to determine whether or not it had racial consequences. And so that pre-clearance clause was determined to be unnecessary by Chief Justice Roberts. And that was the Shelby, the gutting of the pre-clearance clause of such an important clause of the Voting Rights Act. What we need to understand is the hypocrisy of that decision, because the general person doesn't know that John Roberts, when he was an attorney, was this very special child for the conservatives, because he had created this theory on how to gut the Voting Rights Act before he became a judge. So it's quite disingenuous that by the time he becomes a judge, his own theory becomes the decision that he reads, that is Shelby County versus Holder. And then as we go further, they began to say, well, and we see with the Louisiana versus Calais case, well, if you don't have intent to do racial discrimination and harm, then if you can't prove intent, then you can't have these particular voting districts. That
if all you have is the effect, but not the intent.
And the effect was something, that legal concept, that if you looked at all of the different dynamics, you looked at the data, and you saw that the effect was discriminatory, then you had a legal cause of action. But even Donald Trump, through his executive orders, decided to do away with the discriminatory effect. So they, little by little, they chipped away not just at the core of the Voting Rights Act, but now intent-based discrimination is known to be truly difficult to actually find and the evidence, because it's not as though we have the case with Vardaman, who actually gave a speech and wrote and said, we're trying to get rid of the black voter. He actually said that. I mean, he used the N-word. He said this in 1890s. We don't have that as much. We'll see if there is that type of smoking gun, but people are more cautious about what they say. Right. Some will be arrogant enough to say some of these dastardly things out loud, but very few actually do. And without that discriminatory effect, without having the three-judge court reviewing these proposed laws, we've had now this avalanche of changes with districts, with taking away black districts, with looking at these particular cases and saying, well, you haven't proven intent, and so therefore we're going to assume that everyone is equal. Or as that Chief Justice Roberts says, I'm going to stop discrimination if we only just stop discriminating.
Yeah. Right now, there is this frenzy of redistricting that's going on. I mean, Republicans and Democrats. Let's talk about the redistricting process and why it's done and how it's done. It's a requirement of the Constitution, correct? Mm-hmm. It's a requirement. Tell me about how it works.
Well, so you have the U.S. House of Representatives has 435 seats, which are apportioned among the states, and so every 10 years, when the census is taken, you have different numbers and different percentages of voters in various states. And so at that point, each state is, or some states lose congressional seats and some states gain congressional seats. And when that happens, you have to redraw the districts for your state. And so usually it happens once every 10 years. Some state legislatures have different processes. Some have independent commissions that do it. Most will do it with whatever party's in power in the state legislature, they'll have control over it, which has been a boon for the Republicans over the last few cycles. But this is different because we're kind of somewhere in between censuses. And
when was the last census? I don't even remember.
Well, it was 2020. It
Okay,
happened during, you don't remember because it happened during COVID. And
Okay.
so, unfortunately, the redistricting would follow the U.S. Census. And then someone said, well, why must we have it then? Is there a requirement that we must have it then? And that's when they said, we're going to redistrict, and basically in the advantage of our party. For a state, if we're controlling the state and we can control what the redistricting is going to be, then let's redistrict now. And so you saw that happen in Texas. And then the response was the Democrats said, well, what about in California? Let's try to do it. And so now there's been this steamroll of redistricting taking place that's not during the time period that's based on the census.
What are the requirements of the redistricting? What are you supposed to take into consideration? Well, there's the population. What else?
Well, that's where the gerrymandering comes in. Why don't you talk more about that?
well, it's always messy. And there are politicians or elected officials want to draw those districts to maximize votes for their party. And so you get these, this was the term gerrymander, which was named after a legislator named Eldridge Gerry.
And everybody does it. Everybody does it.
Yes, everybody does it. And, everybody does it to maximize. And so you get very strange looking districts, right? Some that are gerrymanders, they got the name because it looked like a salamander, this original shape. And so there are guidelines that you are supposed to try to keep districts compact in a way.
Right, contiguous, right.
Contiguous
right.
also. And when during the era of the Voting Rights Act, I guess now we can talk about that as an era since it's at its close. The idea was that that racial interests had to be protected, that you couldn't just draw districts that would eliminate black voters. And so now this is your question is what happens now really, and the way that the Supreme Court has handled through a circuitous logic, both with Calais and then this Alabama case, this shadow docket case a couple days ago, is to say that some gerrymandering can take place on the basis of partisan identification, but not race. So the problem, of course, is that particularly in the South, often race and party affiliation they overlap.
Yeah,
they're
right.
coterminous. And so this is a way for conservatives to get around this question. They say, oh, well, it's not about race, it's really just about party affiliation. But everybody knows exactly what's going on there, and there's almost no way to disentangle it. So it's a kind of a ruling in very bad faith, I think.
But also there's one thing that's unsaid, and that is that black politicians were not being elected. They were not being supported by white voters. That was one of the reasons why you had to have some of these black districts, because the dilution of the black vote, if you have 4 people in a room and you have 6 white or 6 other people in the room, and the 6 people always win, because they would come together, and no matter how often the 4 people put their names in the hat, they are never going to be the ones selected by the 6. So that's why the 4 had to have their own district so they could elect and have some voice in their own government.
Because sort of historically, not hysterically, but black voters have always voted for white candidates, partly because that's all they had often. But often white voters would not vote for blacks. And to some extent that's true now, less so, but to some extent that's still true. Democrats appearing on talk shows these days speak very confidently about how they're going to take back the House and the Senate in the midterm elections. But meanwhile, the Republicans are working frantically to, gerrymander in their favor. Do you think Democrats are being somewhat overconfident about what the outcome of the midterms is going to be?
I mean, every party has to say they know they're going to win, right?
Yeah,
This is how you get the voters behind you.
Yeah.
I think that Democrats have a slight advantage in upcoming House races for the midterm, which is really why Trump leaned hard on Texas and Tennessee and other states to get this redistricting done now before the midterms, because the Senate is more safe for the Republicans and the House is not, and so they really wanted to do everything they could to try to secure that. So, you know, the question right now is we're in this kind of very open moment where it's things are looking worse and worse for Democrats by the day as these redistricting scrambles happen. I think that Democrats still, I mean, the thing is, it's hard. I think now pollsters are figuring out that it's very hard to predict elections, and it gets more so all the time.
Yeah.
And so partly this will depend on what happens, depends on on these redrawing of these districts. Other factors will come into play as well, of course. But I think it's not fantasy for Democrats to think that they will take the House. I think it's slightly, they have an advantage that puts them maybe slightly more likely to take it than not.
Well, it doesn't take into account corruption. So it's like some other things that you kind of mentioned, some other things that could possibly happen. We've had, people who within the Trump administration go to Georgia and Arizona and other places and actually just take voting ballots. Mm-hmm. We don't know what this administration is going to do to undermine our democracy. So we have people who are running a traditional campaign in a non-traditional environment. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if Democrats know how to pivot to deal with this rough terrain that we're in and the corruption and the things that are happening that are quite non-traditional when it comes to any type of voting. So we don't know, as polls are being, scrubbed of voters, day to day, people are checking to see if their names are even still on voting lists. Mm-hmm. So there are so many things happening. This is probably going back to the time period more like the 1800s, where it's almost the wild, wild west of voting. Yeah. So this idea of having a traditional campaign between now and November, if we're basing that on a traditional campaign, I'm not quite sure what's going to happen. Yeah.
Joe, you have done a lot of research on the right wing, and I'm happy to have you here because I can ask you, the MAGA movement, to what extent is it driven by race?
It's driven extraordinarily by race, but not only. But you remember when Trump announces his candidacy for president in 2015, he immediately opens up with a racist screed against, particularly against Mexicans. But there is, his own political history goes back to the Central Park Five, who were 5 young black men who were finally exonerated for a rape of a white woman, who he made it his life's work to get them behind bars. More recently, when he...
And he paid an ad in the Times to...
yes, a full-page ad in the
Times. Death penalty.
Yes, that's exactly right. During the Obama administration, Trump pushed this idea of birtherism. He became kind of a star of the Tea Party movement at the time because he pushed the racist idea, that conspiracy that Obama didn't have, wasn't born in the U.S., didn't have a birth certificate. This was kind of mixing together anti-black racism, anti-immigrant racism, and Islamophobia all together in one conspiracy. And that kind of catapulted him into national politics. And so that, at its kind of its origin story, founding moment of MAGA really is a deeply racist one. And it was partly in 2016 based on anti-black white grievance, racist anti-immigrant sentiment, racist Islamophobia. So all that was really in the mix there, and it has only kind of metastasized since then. So race is certainly a major component of the movement.
Who do you feel, or what do you feel, have been the most effective forces in pushing back against this erosion of the civil rights movement? Is it the judges? Is it people in the streets?
I think it's been a combination of the people in the streets and the lower court judges, but especially the lower court federal judges. They have really been holding the line for this democracy.
At times, it seemed like they were the only ones.
Yes, and
the line.
Many times. I mean, the fact that you had these major law firms capitulate so early on, meant that the people scrambling, trying to bring these lawsuits to be before the court, because the court could see very serious issues, but they can't alone just make a statement about it. So they had to wait for the cases to be filed. So you have the lawyers who are willing and able to be a part of these lawsuits, the federal court judges. Almost every day you see those lower court judges bringing opinions before us that are common sense, anti-corruption type opinions, and the people in the street. Unfortunately, the protests that we have, whether or not they're No Kings protests or other protests, American opposition protests, they're not telling the people what they should do. That's the missing element. And my other book I have is A Protest History of the United States, and it's over a 500-year arc, and once again looks at the need for protests to disrupt. Protests have, and disruption doesn't mean violence, but disruption has to be something that says you cannot be comfortable in your oppression. And right now, the authoritarian figures are very comfortable in their oppression. It's only the lower court. And then this idea that, well, we'll just wait for the U.S. Supreme Court because they're in our pocket.
Yeah.
And so many people believe that, whether or not, you know, it's more than the two who were personally vetted by Donald Trump, but it's seen as though the six supermajority of conservatives following in political ideology is what's happening right now.
What might that disruption consist of? What might that be?
Well, most disruptions, if we look at George Floyd, if we look at the anti-war movement and the feminist movement and other movements, it's individual people putting a monkey wrench, you could say, in the economic systems. This is what happens during the civil rights movement. You had the sit-ins. The sit-ins actually disrupted the businesses. You have to do something. This is a capitalist country. You're going to have to do something that disrupts the business as usual. And those protests we've had so far haven't done that. They've shown the disdain for the authoritarianism and frustration, but they have not taken that next step, which is necessary in this country. That might work in Europe, but it doesn't work here. In this country, those protests need to go further. The voting rights protests in you know, Martyrs Day, MartyrsDayUS.us is something I've been working on because there are voting rights martyrs. People have lost their lives trying to vote in this country in the 1960s and beyond. I'm not saying that it doesn't come with some level of harm, but I think from a standpoint of the millions of people on the street, that power needs to be used more effectively in disrupting business as usual, corporations and others, so that they pay attention to our undermining of the democracy that's taking place right now.
I would say there's one exception to that, which is the resistance to ICE in Minnesota we saw last winter, which was extraordinary in a couple of ways. One, people did throw a wrench into the works by producing a crisis on the streets. ICE was unable to function without being tailed, without being followed, without being disrupted, without being harassed over and over in the streets, which started with hundreds of activists, then thousands, then tens of thousands, and then finally across the state, hundreds of thousands of people were involved. More so than Democratic Party leaders were comfortable with, either the mayor of Minnesota or the governor of Minnesota or the attorney general even. People kept pushing the line and pushing what they were willing to do and making extraordinary, well, finally, the ultimate sacrifices in a few cases.
In the lives lost.
Yes, and lives lost. And so that was part of what made it so difficult, because I think people around the country saw, people are actually standing up and actually disrupting this and making this stop. But the other point about this being a capitalist country, the economic blackout that happened in January in Minneapolis, organizers got unions out, unions organized, businesses organized, everyday citizens organized to shut down businesses and shut down shopping across the state and to target the major corporations that are based in Minnesota, like Target, for instance. It was that moment when they called for an economic blackout and it was clear that hundreds of thousands of people were going to participate in this. That's when suddenly J.D. Vance comes to Minnesota. That's when, this is a moment when they are nervous. They're like, oh no, we have to stop this. And it's soon after that, finally, that Greg Bovino, the literal Nazi who was running, now he just was by the way, at a white supremacist conference in Europe last week, throwing Hitler open palm salutes. He was removed in that moment, and you know, it's still, ICE operations still go on in Minnesota the way they go on here and everywhere else, but it was a moment where it was that disruption, and it was courageous disruption, and it wasn't just symbolic marches in the street, it was actual direct action, actually people putting their bodies on the line that really did change the calculus and it began to change what ICE can do. I mean, we're seeing similar things happening right now in New Jersey. Yes, and the Delaney facility where there's a hunger strike going on.
And even the Target boycott that's taking place, they've had to remove the CEO of Target. Because,
what's that about? I'm not familiar with that.
Because yes, there's been an ongoing boycott of Target, selective purchasing. People of color not going to buy at Target because Target decided it was going to roll back any type of diversity, equity, inclusion. And diversity, equity, inclusion, I'm hoping lawyers are listening, that they will finally start bringing lawsuits that show that diversity, equity, inclusion actions by this authoritarian regime are also anti-Black, and that's the purpose of them, to undermine Black progress. But the one thing that very quickly we have not talked about and no one talks about is the reason why this is happening right now. And it's because of 2045. In the year 2045, this nation is going to be majority people of color. I knew this 15 years ago. Other people know this who are part of this regime, and they want to put forward an apartheid-type state in which they maintain control no matter what the population is. So we need to understand what the battle is about when it comes to voting rights, the power of the Black vote, the power of people of color to vote, of women, of their rise up economically, socially, politically. All of that is at the crosshairs of what we're witnessing. We have to understand what the full sense of it is, and the vote is at the core of it.
Right. Joe, we got about a minute left. You can have the last word.
I just want to say, I think that this last point is a very important one, and it's important partly because it's a way that the right has been able to enlist white liberals as well. There's a, you know, one of the only differences between this and the end of Reconstruction is that we've seen this chipping away happen of anti-discrimination law and policy and affirmative action happening from really the 70s onward. And it's because a lot of white people are really uncomfortable with this fact and with the idea of Black equality and brown equality. And so when this anti-woke stuff happens on the right, they don't oppose it the way they should be opposing it. They don't come out, you know, and this is what kind of allows these things to happen, is when people don't see that the alarm is sounding and that their own democratic rights are going to be hurt by this too. It should, in a self-interested way, they should be thinking about this. But partly that's what it is. This is a deeply white supremacist country. It was founded in Black slavery and settler colonialism, and those things go beyond just the right or the MAGA movement. They're things that we have to confront generally in a way that the right is now hoping that they can erase from history altogether.
Yes, you said 2025. I think the
2045.
2045. Yes, because I remember, and when that report came out, it was front page article on every newspaper. It was news on every TV show, and I remember writing a column about it. You know, why is this such big news? And I think it was for exactly the same reasons you were saying. So, unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to thank Gloria Browne-Marshall, Professor of Constitutional Law at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and author of The Voting Rights War, and Joseph Lowndes, Professor of Political Science at Hunter College and Director of the Public Policy Program at Hunter's Roosevelt House. Thank you for joining me today. To learn more about our upcoming shows, you can follow us on Instagram at 1-to-1 CUNY TV, and you can watch the show on the go by downloading the CUNY TV app. For 1-to-1 and CUNY TV, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.